Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Lisa Fensky, the Digital Specialist at SICK, and I'll be your moderator. Our topic today shares the 6 steps to a safe collaborative robot. This is especially relevant for the consumer goods industry as the use of collaborative and mobile robots continues to increase. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to let our audience members know that a recording of this webinar will be emailed to you following today's presentation. Also, feel free to ask any questions during the time of this webinar by typing them into the Q&A section on the right hand of your screen. We will take some time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as time allows. With us today is a distinguished expert that I am privileged to introduce. Mark Nierkorn, Director of the Safety RCC Americas at SICK, holds a bachelor's degree in engineering management from DeVry. He has over 32 years of controls and automation experience and over 29 years of machine safeguarding experience. Mark has been directly involved in the application of machine safeguarding for all types of manufacturing facilities, which makes him an excellent speaker to talk about today's topic. With that, why don't we get started? Mark, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Hope everyone can hear me. Good morning. Glad you've joined us this morning. We're going to focus today on a quick update, if you will, an overview of the North American robot standards and guidance for safe implementation of collaborative robots specifically, and a quick update on the RIA, the R1508, the Mobile Robotics Committee. That is working on a new standard, so we'll give you an update on what we're hearing from that committee. Presentation again will take about 40 minutes or so, and we hope to have some time at the end for some questions. So as Lisa mentioned, please type them in to the chat box so we can cover those as we go. So when we discuss industrial robots, you know, in a traditional terms, we think of large industrial automation, robots used in automation, and maybe automotive, manufacturing, powerful, dangerous, right? And we always typically think about the separation of man and machine when it comes to keeping people separated by space and or time. Now, this new approach, as you are well aware, for autonomous or collaborative robots, if you will, we still need to make sure that they're safe. So what I hope to cover today real quick is just an overview of why we want to do that, what does the law, what do the regulations say about doing that, and then how do we go about doing that and keeping some things in mind for doing that safely. And so when we look at collaborative robotics, yeah, they can be very productive, but we want to make sure that we don't harm people with the implementation of these solutions. So our first poll question, if we have a poll question. So our first poll question: are you currently using collaborative robots? So Lisa, is that poll question? There it is.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So how many of you are currently using or planning on using a collaborative robot? And you can submit that question. Have about 30 seconds or so, and we'll get the answers back. And kind of gives me an idea of the audience and what you're currently involved in. Maybe some of you are looking to get started with collaborative robots. You may have questions. So it gives me an idea of what we have.
The results should show up in just a few seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So let's move on. Looks like about 50-50, you know, yes and no. So that's good. So let's continue on. Hopefully we can cover all the bases here for everybody. So when we take a look at all machines, but specifically when we look at robotics, we look at what we call the 6 steps. It's an application of a methodical process, a logical process of looking to implementing a safe solution when it comes to robotics. So we always talk about the laws and then the standards that support those laws or regulations. And in this case, we'll start with the RIA R1506, which is the North American Robot Standard. So we'll take a look at that. Then, once we understand the requirements of the C-type standard, we look to its requirements, and typically what you're going to find is the topic of risk assessment. So we want to proceed with trying to understand where the tasks are performed and the hazards that are going to be associated with those tasks, and then documenting that through the risk assessment process. Out of the risk assessment process, we end up with a safety requirement specification that will take us into a 3-step process called safe design, implementing technical protective measures. These are safety functions. These are separating man and machine by space and time, and then administrative measures to reduce the risk. So this 3-step process allows us to drive the risk associated with those tasks and hazards according to the requirements in the safety requirement specification. In the end, the standard gives us guidance on how to do an overall validation to ensure that we have met the intent of what we set out to do based on the safety requirement specification. Again, this is the documentation step to ensure compliance and to fulfill the requirements. And then if we're looking to place the machine into production or on the market, if we're selling, if we're an integrator, we're going to pass on some information to the end user so that they may continue to further ensure the reduction of risk based on maybe some of the identified administrative measures that will get passed on to the end user. So this is the typical approach we take with any machine, but specifically this is how we go about ensuring a safe, compliant robotics application, including collaborative robotics. So if we take a look at those laws and standards, and we take a look at North America, specifically in the U.S., we look to OSHA. And OSHA is our legal framework, right? And it gives us requirements under the General Duty Clause that requires that the end user provide a safe work environment for all their employees, free from known hazards. Now, there's not a lot of guidance on how to do that, specifically for robotics within the OSHA requirements. However, in the General Duty Clause, they do point you towards third-party consensus standards where they're available, which will give you guidance, additional guidance. And you'll find these in ANSI, the ASME, the RIA, of course, which we're talking about today, the North American Robot Standard, CSA. These standards then support the intent of OSHA, giving you guidance on how to do this properly and how to reduce risk. So, however, these standards are voluntary. There's no legal requirement that you have to follow it. However, it can be used by the regulatory bodies to support any citations should there be an issue or an accident. They may cite you in the General Duty Clause that you haven't fulfilled your requirement to provide a safe work environment, but they will use these standards then to support their case and say there is guidance here available, you didn't follow it, and therefore you ended up with the situation that we have. So for us today, we're going to talk about the R1506. This is the Industrial Robot Standard, including collaborative robots and also testing methods for power and force limiting, which quite a few of these collaborative robot installations, as we will talk about here shortly, will use power and force limiting in some form or fashion as a risk reduction strategy. So we want to take a look at what that entails and how to go about doing that properly. So in harmonization with ISO 10218, parts 1 and 2, The RIA has adopted the ISO standard, but there were some changes that needed to take place to align between the old standard and our old R1506 and this new adoption. So we had to update some things to include some terminology, some technology, functional safety is part of the requirement now for the safety-related parts of the control system. Safety-related soft access and space limiting was a new technology feature that was adopted, and new clearance requirements to come into harmonization with ISO. So we now have a clearance requirement of 20 inches inside of a robot cell. Requirements for collaborative operation. This was a new feature back then, and we had information. One of the big changes, obviously, risk assessments became a shall. It is no longer optional. It is a requirement to comply with the machinery directive and the EU. And because this was an adoption of an EN standard, the ISO 10218 risk assessment is a requirement now. So ISO 10218 is harmonized in Europe to show a presumption of conformity to the machinery directive. Part 1 is laid out for industrial robot manufacturers. These are the people making the robot and the controller, and those requirements are for them. Part 2 is for the user of the robot, the implementation, the integration. So these stakeholders are robot system designers, integrators, and installers of the robot. But what we are missing, because of ISO 10218 is a OEM or an integrator type standard, we're missing the end user requirements. Now, the old version of the R1506 contained that information, but has now been stripped out. So the RIA has thought to put back a lot of this end user and other requirements back in via technical reports. So over the last several years, several committees in the RIA have been working on putting back some of the technical support information that was removed during the adoption of ISO 10218. Parts 1 and 2. And we will look at a few of these standards. We won't look at all of them today, but we will talk about just a few around collaborative robotics. So these technical supplementary documents are technical reports. We're going to take a look at specifically at TRR 15606, which is an adoption of ISO technical standard 15066 for collaborative robotics. These are the safety requirements for implementing power and force limiting. One thing to keep in mind is that in the ISO world, in a technical specification, it is normative, meaning the shalls hold just as much weight in the normal base standard as 10218, where in the ANSI version, a technical report, we're only permitted to have recommended or information. However, the intent is still the same. If you're going to comply and you're going to apply this standard and reap the benefits of it, then read the shalls as, read the shoulds, excuse me, as shalls, and as a full alignment then with 15066. Now there are a handful of these in process. 806 actually was released. This is the safety requirements for testing methods for power and force limiting. We will talk a little bit about what's in there. So let's take a look at the base standard. So the base standard, again, one of the requirements is for risk assessment. If you recall, in the 6 steps, that was the first step. Again, as we spoke about the guidance being removed, there has been, this information has been put back in the technical report of R15306, which will give you guidance on the risk assessment. And there are other standards available to end users or integrators, manufacturers who want to conduct risk assessments. Obviously, ISO 12100, which is harmonized to the machinery directive to show a presumption of conformity to the machinery directive, is available. And here in North America, several companies or organizations may already be using ANSI B11.0. This is also a standard that's harmonized with 12100, and of course is harmonized with 306. And those key elements are always to analyze the risk, evaluate the risk, reduce the risk during the three-step process, and then assess any residual risk, and then ongoing change management for the risk reduction process. So we won't take a real deep dive here, but in essence, the initial level of risk is typically not acceptable when we look at the tasks and the hazards, and we want to implement these risk reduction measures or strategies to slowly but surely remove or reduce either hazard sources or exposure to those hazard sources, or mitigate them through the three-step process. Some of these steps are taken both by the manufacturer of the robot in the way of guards and covers and the control system for technical protective measures, at least for the implementation of technical protective measures, to provide things like e-stops and guard stops or safe stops, and certainly collaborative operation, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. And then also pass this capability or these risk reductions on to the integrator. These are the people adding the next parts of the puzzle as we build a robot system or a robot cell or line, or even an application. They're going to have to address the tasks and hazards now associated with that new solution. So that has to be done then and taken on by the user. So all measures, obviously, that we can reduce or eliminate and address early on in the process is always better than later in the process. Once some decisions have been made, some of those will be a little harder to do. So always keep that in mind when you're laying out your robot system or cell. If you're an integrator or even an end user, think about your tasks, think about your location, think about everybody who has to work in or around the robot, and ensure that you've covered all aspects of that before, as I mentioned, something gets designed in that becomes very hard to take care of at maybe at a later stage. So risks are to be reduced using the hazard control hierarchy. Again, safe design measures are the most efficient and effective when implemented early on. Technical protective measures for anything that can't be eliminated or reduced by safe design measures. And then ultimately, we have administrative measures to handle residual risk, information for use, and certainly PPE are all good approaches to further reducing or eliminating hazards associated with the use of the equipment. So let's take a look at a few key definitions from the standard, specifically when it comes to collaborative robotics. A collaborative robot is a robot that's designed for direct interaction with humans, and this is done inside a defined collaborative workspace, okay? Now, the collaborative operation, which is different than the robot itself, is when this purposely designed robot works in direct cooperation within the defined workspace. And then this collaborative workspace within the safeguarded space where the robot and human are expected to perform simultaneously during production some form of interaction. Now, there are 4 different ways we're going to look at collaboration. Not all forms of collaboration necessarily need a collaborative robot. However, if you're not going to implement a true collaborative robot, this very specifically designed robot to perform a collaborative operation, power and force limiting will not be afforded to you for a risk reduction strategy. Most industrial robots, while you can still interact with them, they're going to be at zero motion. So they'll use speed and separation monitoring and safe speed. This is done so that you may interact with the robot. However, it is not a collaborative robot because it doesn't include power and force limiting. And we'll take a look at that. When we talk about the collaborative workspace, and maybe some of you are intending to build a small collaborative application, maybe you're working with collaborative applications, this collaborative space has to be defined within the restricted space. So where the robot can operate, we want to limit and restrict its operation to the application so that we don't have unnecessary movement in areas where we can reduce and restrict this space and keep the robot's movement, as small as necessary for the application, is reasonably practical. And then inside of that space, where we expect the human and the robot to work together or have this collaborative application or come in contact with each other, we're going to need to define that, and we want to know where that will be. During the risk assessment, this is important, as we will see when we implement power and force limiting. We're going to need to know what those interactions look like, because we're going to have to set the right forces and monitor those forces and ensure that the operator, where they expect to come in contact with the robot, will be done in a safe way if we're going to implement power and force limiting. So as I mentioned, there are 4 different methods for human-robot collaboration outlined in the standard, right? There's safety-rated monitored stop. This is available in all modes of operation and even used for non-collaborative robots. There's hand guiding, speed and separation or distance monitoring, where we can slow the robot down as humans approach, ultimately maybe implementing a safety-rated monitored stop. And if the application allow for a restoration of the speed and the operation as people leave the area, if they can be constantly monitored by the technical protective measures. And then last but not least, power and force limiting. Power and force limiting is a method and is a risk reduction implementation of a technical protective measure. It is a specially designed function within the robot controller and the robot hardware and software, and therefore is a risk reduction method used for implementing one of the methods for collaborative operation. So here we have poll question number 2, real quick. For those of you who have, I guess, so this is for the 50%, or maybe even if you're going to be implementing a collaborative robot application, have you implemented power and force limiting as your technical protective measure, or are you intending to if you're planning on implementing a power and force limiting application, or a collaborative application? So while that poll question is being taken, we'll move on. Keep the presentation moving, if you will. So let's take a look at each one of these and take a look at a few details on the methods for collaborative operation. So for safety-rated monitored stop, autonomous operation, no person is necessary in the collaborative workspace. If a person approaches the robot and is sensed, right? Okay, so 62% of you looks like a pretty good number are planning on implementing power and force limiting. Good, that's very good. So let's talk about that. So for safety-rated monitored stop, again, a person once they are sensed within the restricted space of the application, the robot will come to a complete stop. And it will keep power on the drives. They will be available to restart and won't lose its position, right? And they may interact at that point with the robot. They may load a part at the end of the arm. They might take a part. They might inspect a part. They might attach something to a workpiece the robot is holding, something along that line. But in this method of collaboration, there is no robot movement while the operator is in the restricted space or the collaborative workspace. Hand guiding. Hand guiding is permitted, but you do have to meet a few of the requirements. The manufacturer of the robot should provide you with a safety-rated guiding device that meets Part 1 requirements for the manufacturer of the robot and the robot controller that will actually take over at a takeover point where there's a safety-rated monitored stop. The operator can then guide the robot using this three-position enabling device, much like a teach pendant, where the robot can be safely manipulated into position, guided, if you will, and then once the operator can see the whole workspace, they can implement this feature. And then a safety-rated monitored stop is issued when the operator releases the guiding device, and then it can be put back either in autonomous or it may be set aside and used during another process. Speed and separation monitoring then is used with robots that will still have a safety-rated monitored stop, right? But the minimum separation distance between any persons approaching the safeguarded space and ultimately the collaborative space is determined by the risk assessment. So how fast is the robot moving? Where is it? If it's on the other side, reaching away from the operator, as the operator approaches, it may slow down. If it's coming towards the operator, then that may happen sooner as the person is detected as they approach the robot in the collaborative space. Again, the robot can slow down, decreasing that necessary distance as the robot can stop more quickly. But that distance always has to be kept and maintained by the settings afforded by the presence sensing device used, maybe a 2D LiDAR area protection used to slow the robot down until you come in contact, or maybe retrace your steps and leave the area. Then the robot can pick back up and resume at full speed. So this is speed and separation monitoring. Now this again is typically implemented also with safety-rated monitored stop for machine tending applications, maybe for a packaging or a small palletizer application. In the consumer goods, obviously there's a lot of applications for bin picking, for material, for end products being maybe in primary packaging, or small boxes or cartons for secondary packaging. This is typically if it's implemented in those stages. This is sometimes when you don't need an operator in the area all the time. So as they approach to either do a quality check or to maybe pick up something that is dropped on the floor or off the conveyor or something, they may need to come in and do some intervention. And when they do that, the robot can sense them slow down and come to a safety-rated monitored stop. And as long as they can leave and be detected during that portion of the cycle, they can possibly retrace their steps and leave the area, and the robot can continue on with its work. And last but not least, power and force limiting by design or control. So this is when the specially designed robot, so this is a very specific type of robot, a collaborative robot, which has a power and force measurement device, again, hardware and software, that meets Part 1 requirements provided by the manufacturer of the robot, can be implemented. Again, this is determined by the risk assessment, right? So when we talk about doing a risk assessment, why is that so important? Well, these inherently safe robots, as it is implied, that the robot is completely safe out of the box. The manufacturer has taken care of everything for you, and not so quick. There's a few things we have to think about, right? So they do contain the hardware according to Part 1, which means that the performance level for the safety-related part of the control system, including the power and force measurement functions built into the robot, are of performance level D, category 3, according to ISO 13849. and it has to maintain the safety rated force and speed limiting per ISO 15066 or the TRR 15606, which is an adoption. So we will take a look at what that means. But yes, the robot is designed specifically to provide this function. That doesn't mean that that is all the answers to all of the problems, right? We have to think of the things that the manufacturer of those robots haven't thought about. Again, this is part 2 requirements now. You take one of these robots and you decide to implement it into an application. The first thing you may think about is your end-of-arm tooling. What are you going to do with that robot, right? So as we think about the end-of-arm tooling, we now may have new hazards associated with the implementation of the end-of-arm tooling that we now have to consider during our power and force measurement. Sometimes this isn't as easy as it sounds and creates issues where we may not actually be able to get the risk reduction we need simply by using power and force measurement. So we have to take care of the end-of-arm tooling. Next is the actual workpiece or the process itself. We also have hazards associated with the workpiece. Maybe it's glass, maybe it's heat, welding, maybe it's woodworking or chips, something from the process, right? These things also create, these workpieces or the process can create, because robots do a really nice job of eliminating these, as we say, these nasty, dirty jobs. It reduces risk because the operator can be removed from the process. However, if you're going to do a collaborative operation, for whatever reason, you have to really think about, is collaboration necessary? If the person isn't going to necessarily need to be right here during this operation, then is that really collaborative or is it more cooperative? And if I implement a collaborative robot, can I only implement power and force limiting, or will I need to combine or even use another method for risk reduction because of the workpiece of the process and the end-of-arm tooling? So these are things to consider during your application. And again, if we're going to use speed and separation monitoring, safety-rated monitored stop, and the sequencing, these are ways that we can provide collaboration, as I just mentioned, where we have hazards associated with the movement where maybe power and force limiting won't actually get us the risk reduction we're looking for. So we may need to think about safe robot speed, safe robot stop, or even safe robot sequence. And sometimes you can combine these. You may need to use safe robot speed or sequence, but once the operator's there, maybe the robot can slow down and go in, and you can change modes over to power and force limiting if there's a task or an application that can be done at a slower speed with slower force. And then once the person leaves, that part of the application is no longer necessary, then maybe the robot can speed back up and run in an unattended application at a higher, more productive rate. So things to think about when we're implementing a system. So power and force limiting. Let's talk a little bit more about what we have to think about when it comes to implementing collaborative robotics if we're going to use power and force limiting, right? As I mentioned, the RIA, the R15606, is an adoption, a U.S. adoption of ISO TS 15066. This is for robots and robotic devices, collaborative robots. This technical report provides guidance primarily to suppliers and integrators when they're implementing collaborative robot systems. So they're actually designing applications, right? The standard includes important data from a study. We're going to take a look at this here in a minute of these pain thresholds that are in Annex A. The data helps application or the designers of applications when we expect that the operator will come in contact with a robot implemented power and force limiting that we ensure that force is a safe force. So this technical standard does allow for the impact of the robot into a human, but we had to understand what does that look like when we have force and pressure exerted on a part of the human body. And there's a couple different ways we have to think about that. We may have a transient impact where the operator will be contacted by the robot under movement, but is not a continuous pressure. It has an impact. It has a force, and then of course there's a rebound effect. There's no entrapment. The person can move away or be pushed away or back away or stop the robot, but there's no continuous pressure. In a quasi-static type situation, there may be an ongoing continuous pressure then that might be exerted on a certain part of the body. So this technical report then is based again on a study done at the University of Mainz. They built a machine that tested pain thresholds and the onset of not only the pain threshold, but maybe actual specific injuries to different parts of the body. They needed to understand the body model and what parts of the body you could exert certain amounts of forces on by the robot, by the end effector or the tooling or the workpiece. Because if we're going to use power and force limiting as a risk reduction strategy, we have to understand what these values are so that we can limit them based on the risk assessment telling us if the operator is doing task A and during that task there is a possibility that his hand may get crushed by the end effector of the collaborative operation, then we need to understand how much force can be exerted on the hand at that point during the operation by that workpiece, tool, and so on. So this is the idea that we need to think about that based on the risk assessment. So this research, they conducted over 100 different people, different types and ages, and male and female, left and right-handed, dominant hands, different types of bodies, of course, but in the end, in Annex A, then they published the information on the different parts of the body and where the forces exerted on different parts of the body, where were the pain thresholds, where were the onset of pain and the onset of injury, so that we could restrict the power and force necessary based on the risk. So one thing that came out from this study is that anything really in the face, neck, temple region above the is off limits. We don't want to have any contact. So care must be taken during the risk assessment to understand, can I keep the robot restricted to below the shoulders? Certainly training needs to be implemented and maybe PPE, possibly hard hats, protective measures taken so that there isn't contact with the head. This is not an easy thing to do, but you have to implement this to ensure that there isn't contact under robot power with movement, and contact then occurs above the shoulders. This is something that's very, very important, so we want to ensure that. So if you implement power and force limiting, according to TS 15066 or TR 15606. You can set these thresholds during these movements. You can set the force and the speed and combination of force and speed within the robot controller. However, you need to validate that. So you need to test and evaluate within the application of power and force limiting that you truly are indeed getting the actual values to meet up for the requirements. If you think about the robot manufacturer, they can only do so much. They don't understand the full extent of your end of arm tooling and your workpiece. So yes, I can set the speed in the controller. I can set the force limitations and measurements and the cutout points, if you will, inside the controller. However, again, the manufacturer really can't tell how big of a surface area your workpiece has, or how sharp your workpiece is, or your end of arm tooling is, and the surface area where the force is spread out. So this is something that has to be qualified then in the field once it's implemented. So once you've implemented your system and you understand the workpiece, the momentum, the mass of the workpiece or the tool, and or both, and the surface areas, you need to validate these that you're actually getting the right forces and pressures according to what you're intended based on the body model, where the risk assessment outlines that you may have contact. So in this situation, we use a tool. There's a force and pressure measurement. There's several tools on the market, but this is used then to take these measurements, both force and pressure, so that we can validate where we expect to have contact. And you may find out that you either need to slow the robot down during a certain operation because now it's holding the workpiece. The workpiece actually can exert more force or even more pressure on parts of the body where you expect the contact. So you need to take these measurements. And this standard or this technical report gives you guidance on how to take these measurements and gives you a little bit of understanding of how to qualify that during your validation process. And I have a few slides here at the end, just to give you a quick update then on the industrial mobile robot. So quick, if you do have any questions on the collaborative robot standard portion, the quick update, go ahead and put them into the chat box, the Q&A box, and we will get to those here in a few minutes once we wrap up with the industrial mobile robot portion. So under development right now, under the RIA, R1508 is a new standard, a new work group, if you will, on industrial mobile robots. So I'll give you a quick update of what this is about. As you can see from the pictures here, this is basically what we're looking at, but not completely. So, you know, if we have an existing AGV, let's say, covered under B56.5, which is the existing AGV standard for North America, and or you have an articulated robot, an industrial robot, covered under the aforementioned R1506 that we just discussed, and you combine those together, you end up with something that you know, has a little bit of a different application, possibly. And as a C-type standard, it's important that we understand the application and how these might be used so that we can think about significant hazards and moving. If articulated robots are typically fixed in place, do we have movement while they're being used, or does the base move and then comes to rest, and then the articulated robot is performing some operation? And so there has to be some guidance then for some of these new technologies that are being developed. So they came up with a current definition in the scope of what we call industrial mobile robots. So the first thing that came out of this is that it is industrial, right? That you've seen some of the robots, the industrial autonomous mobile applications. Some of them are in grocery stores. Some of them are in public spaces. They're delivering packages on sidewalks, or they're doing something, you know, in the public space. So first of all, they are out of scope. This is an industrial standard, so those type of applications aren't going to be covered under this, right? It is mobile, but it refers to ground-based systems. The standard is not going to try to address things on rails, airborne or waterborne systems, right? If they are going to be outside, which is okay, in rough terrain, then the environmental impacts just have to be addressed, and you'll have to think about that during your risk assessment and the intended use for this mobile application. So that has to be thought about. Now, the robot here, there are three different constructs that they're thinking about, right? There's an industrial robot manipulator attached to a mobile base that may or may not be fully autonomous. A mobile base that possesses a degree of autonomy greater than that of a traditional AGV, right? And even if it has or doesn't have a robotic arm attached to the base. And then a single unit designed to have the capabilities of both a mobile base and a robotic arm, and a degree of autonomy capable of operating in a dynamic environment. So this is what they're really attempting to cover via this new standard, right? Again, they're looking at a three-part standard. Suppliers, much like 10218 or R1506, and integrators are covered in parts 1 and 2, but they do intend to have a part 3 for end users. Requirements for people who must use these, right? Ongoing issues. So the thing that they're really wrestling with in this is that it really, in the beginning, it looks fairly simple. Mobile platforms, robots, combination. Simple Venn diagram. However, in reality, it's a little bit more than that. There's autonomy, there's hardware, there's platforms, there's transportation, there's attachments, there's mechanisms, there's software, cloud-based navigation, right? AI, SLAM. There are other applications, other technical issues with this type of devices and this technology that have to be considered under all situations. So this is what they're working on. So in first glance, first of all, to cover again what the standard will and won't cover. Articulated robots. So if we have an industrial application and it has a manipulator, then we already have a standard for that. That's the R1506. That will not be covered by this standard, right? If we have a traditional AGV, right? So we have an industrial application. It has no autonomous navigation, and it is a guided vehicle. We already have a standard for that. That's B56.5, and that is not covered under this new standard, right? However, if we have a autonomous mobile platform now, an industrial application, then this will be a Type A AMR, autonomous mobile robot. If we have a Type A AMR with an attachment, but it is not a manipulator, 3 or more axis, then this will become a Type B. This is what their idea is. And ultimately then, if we have a manipulator on top of a mobile platform, 3 or more axes, then this will become a Type C, right? And that will also include a combination then of an attachment on top of an AGV that looks very similar to a Type C that will also be covered or attempted to be considered under this standard. So, that being the case, that is the update on the R1508. So just a quick overview. So in closing, I just want to let you know that we at SICK, we cover safety standards around the globe, and we try to ensure that we can bring to our customers the latest information and the latest guidance on how to perform those 6 steps, as I mentioned, for not only our consumer goods and our automotive and other customers and electronics and solar, storage and conveyor. We cover all of our different industries because we have experts in these areas that cover these industries as well as safety in these areas. We supply robotic services for all industries, including risk analysis, safety concept, design, and support for validation around the globe. SICK has more than 200 professionals around the globe that are trained in doing these services and helping customers develop solutions, safe solutions to the current standards. So with that, I want to thank you for attending. If you have to leave, again, thanks for your participation today. We do have a couple questions, it looks like. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in, but let's cover the first one. So what products are available to measure the pressure and/or force exerted by cobots on personnel? So if you have a type 1, if you have a robot designed to part 1 of the standard, and it is a collaborative, a purposely designed robot, it will have the power and force limiting features built in. However, there are aftermarket products like air skins or bump skins that can also be an active, dynamic, pressure-sensitive skin that can be added to the robot to further decrease contact forces, especially the elbows and the joints of these collaborative robots can cause some damage. Remember, when you look at power and force on some of these collaborative robots and you look at the tool point, the end of the end effector, the tool point, that's where they're controlling the speed. Some of the elbows can actually be moving quicker, even though the tool point is not moving very quickly. So you have to always think about how you program your path, and sometimes these types of products can help eliminate some of those forces that you might end up with. So other than that, as I mentioned, we have there are some available products to do power and force measurements, again, for the application, for the validation. We use one. That's one of a few. There's several different manufacturers available, but we use a tool from a company called GTE to do our validations on our collaborative robotic applications. Next question. Does the speed and force limiting safety standards specify the frequency of validating performance post-implementation? That's a good question. There are some recommendations in 806 on the frequency. Again, nothing real specific, but certainly if there are changes to the tooling, if there are changes to the application that should trigger another assessment in a revalidation, most certainly. If some companies we work with are taking an annual approach to their retesting frequency, which is a good rule of thumb. It's used quite regularly in other inspection services for presence sensing devices on mechanical power-driven machinery in Europe. So we've adopted that approach unless there is a higher risk or some other application or something about the application that might demand or might lead to something more often. Next question. Since mobile robot standards are under development, what is the best compliance strategy now? Well, that's an excellent question. Right now, manufacturers are looking to the AGV standard for the mobile parts of their base and or application, because there is a lot of guidance in there, and they realize that quite a bit of that information, or at least thinking, it is state of the art, will end up in those parts of the same application within the 1508. It won't be complete, but it's a good starting point. Same goes with the R1506. So if the mobile base is fixed and the articulated robot is now moving, if you have that attached to the mobile base, AMR type C, then you can imagine that you can treat that collaborative robot or that articulated robotic arm much like the R1506 would. So really what you're doing is you're already thinking about, and when you do a risk assessment, you're thinking about, is this moving? Is this the same application? Is maybe I can use or adapt the 1506 in this part, the B56.5 in this application to the mobile base when it's under power and moving, right? So if you'll apply those standards for now, and you think about things as you do your risk assessment and your implementation, you can get pretty close. And I think you have to do the best you can with what you can work with right now, and that would be my recommendation of a strategy for now. Will this presentation be available? Lisa, I think you can address that.
Yes, absolutely. We will send an email out soon after this presentation with the recording, so you can see the slides and all that Mark discussed. We'll also have it on our website at SIC.com under webinar recordings. So there's a few ways to get a hold of it.
Thank you, Lisa. A couple more questions. Do the collaborative standards specify the need for third-party validations of the process, or can the end user self-validate? Absolutely. The end user can self-validate. And as a requirement, I would say when the end user receives something from an integrator, partner, or if they are the integrator and the manufacturer, quite often that's the case, the end user is one and the same, it doesn't necessarily require a third party. However, in our recommendation is to always be a disinterested party within the same organization is also something of the same intent. We typically have a trained functional safety engineer do the design, but we may have another trained functional safety engineer who is not involved with the design do the review or the validation. Therefore, they're not thinking about their own implementation, and the bias then hopefully is removed. There's no requirement for a third party at this point. It could be self-validated. Next question: if access is maintenance only, is it considered collaborative application? Well, the collaborative application will actually, to have a collaborative application, you have to fall into one of the 4 types of human-robot collaboration. Maintenance is not a production task. If you recall, collaborative is a production operation. So during the production or the productivity, the production of the production operation, that is when collaboration takes place during that portion. Maintenance should only be done under lockout tagout and based on the risk assessment. If alternative measures are implemented in lieu of lockout tagout, you must meet the definition currently of 1910-147. So it has to be routine, has to be integral to production. So maybe an adjustment's okay, but changing something or maintaining something your company says this exceeds normal production task, this is something that is a true maintenance task, then that's done under lockout tagout. So that would not meet that muster, and therefore would not be implemented during collaborative operation. If you're using reduced speed and force monitoring, can you have a collaborative robot running a cell that does not have any guarding or protective measures to prohibit a person from entering? Yeah, this is the question, or this is really the buzz in the industry is fenceless safety. I don't need any safety, right? And hopefully what I've shown today is that the collaborative robot, while it may have power and force limiting implemented, if your application can be completed, or you can do the work you need to do with the reduced power and force that meets the intent of 15066 or 606, meaning the forces based on your risk assessment can be low enough that we don't have injury when the robot or the workpiece or the end effector contacts the operator, then power and force limiting can be your risk reduction strategy, okay? So when we say it doesn't have any safety or protective devices, that's really not true. Power and force limiting is a protective measure, right? So it is always going to have at least that, but you still have to think about all the hazards associated with the process. if you can take care of all of them with power and force limiting according to 15066, then nothing else may need to be provided. You're correct. Well, that looks like that's the last question. If there isn't anything else, we're right at 1 hour. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and have a safe and productive week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.